Hey all, welcome to TAOTalks episode 2. Today we talk about the concept of who we are. We kind of start with the evolutionary branch off point of how we evolved to have the ability to ask questions like who we are, the meaning of life and things like that, and how that differs from different species on this earth. And then we kind of end off by talking about some tangible things that we can do to observe ourselves and what that could mean for ourselves, and how doing it over and over and the practice of can lead to different outcomes in life. I hope you enjoy this episode, and thank you for watching. Hey Jesse. How you doing?
Good.
Nice.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah.
So I think today I'd like to dive into who am I? We left off on that, and before I met you, this is how I would answer that question. This is how I would think about that question. If I would ask myself, who am I? Or someone else would ask me, who am I? And be like, I'm Smith. I'm an engineer. I'm a scientist. Recently, I'm a designer. I'm a son, brother, a partner. I am Indian. I'm a young adult. I think they're all true. Yet, I think what we want to get into today is a little different than that. And that kind of depth, I hadn't really evaluated before about myself. And I want to know what you mean when you say to others that they ought to know who they are, or really evaluate who they are.
There's a lot to unpack there. I guess the place where I would start is the things that you described are the knowing things, the things that we know about ourselves.
Tangible.
You can think the things that are in the light, the things that are in our awareness, our ability to see. And then there's the things about us that are not as visible. They're, the sun casts a certain, its rays in a certain direction. On the backside, there's shadows. So we can see where the sun, brings light, but we don't always see where things are still dark. And that's still very much a part of us.
Mm-hmm.
And what that unknowing part of us is, runs deep. It has we can go through our dimensions. It has a physical dimension based on evolution, based on how our bodies are designed, our nervous system. There's aspects of how we respond in the world that are outside of the scope of what our knowing. There are things in which we respond in the world that we don't have control over. And we can learn about that side of us. We can have a knowing of it, even though there's always going to be a level in which it's outside of our control. Like getting a knowing of it doesn't bring it into our control, but giving us a knowing of it brings us at least into an awareness of a greater understanding of who we are.
Closer to.
And I would say that, there's the knowing side of, if we come back to the dimensions of our being, of who we are to be, what it means to be human, that physical, mental, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, that there is a light side at each of those dimensions, and there is a shadow side that of what we don't know. And shadow is not a negative, right? Shadow doesn't mean these are the areas in which we're bad or we're wrong. It's just they're outside of that the rays of sun in which we can see the things that we're drawn to.
So those things you're saying that they exist, right? Like it's not unknown and untrue. I think we are talking about there are things as beings, you, me, the rest of the world, individual human beings have this light, like the sun made it visible to us side of things at every single level of the pyramid system or the dimensions, as well as there's things that are true about individual selves that's in the shadow of ourselves that we're essentially blind to because it happens to be that there's no light there.
Correct.
So it exists. How do you see that? Like, how does that mean we are bringing in a flashlight and we're putting in, just to keep going with the analogy of we're going to highlight those areas, or how do you see it? Or do we access it in the dark?
I think it starts with just learning how to observe
Ourselves.
Yeah. So we started with a meditation. An interesting conversation we had even before our meditation was talking about disturbance.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we do a meditation together? How do you start it? How do you end it without one disturbing the other's meditation? And I got to reflect on that while we were in our meditation because there's this fan that's going on and off, right?
Me too.
There's horns in the background, right? So there's disturbances all around us.
Yeah.
What is the purpose of meditation if it's not to observe disturbance? And in the observance of disturbance, it's observing how we respond to that disturbance. Do we get annoyed at the fan? Or are we able to take the fan as background noise, and instead of paying attention to the fan, we're paying attention to how we're responding to the fan?
The feelings
that come up, the annoyance. Why am I fixated on this fan instead of paying attention to what's going on in my heart?
Or even the questioning, for that matter, right?
Yeah. Well,
and
then what comes out of that is like, do I get into a rush to get out of the meditation, or do I let it sit longer in order to be in this uncomfortableness with it? All of that is just a practice of observation. And as we observe, we start to see patterns, right? The patterns of how we react, respond moment to moment. So there's the observance creates an opportunity for learning.
I think that warrants us going into the concept of observer selves. And I think that warrants how that came to be the evolutionary, like your take on it.
If we go far enough back in our timeline as human beings, we were at the same evolutionary level of apes and monkeys. And we can observe apes and monkeys in the world. And there's a lot of, I think it's like 98, 99% of
closeness,
of match, not just genetically, but also neurologically, in fight or flight processing, how we respond to the world. But when we observe apes and monkeys, we don't observe them in ritual to the same degree as humans do. I think we see some levels of ritual. I think ritual exists. But the human experience of ritual, the human experience of spirituality is a completely, I mean, it evolved. It's evolved from ape and from monkey. Still very much ape. We're still great. We're still apes.
Yeah.
And that's part of the shadow of who we are, is that we are still creatures in nature, and we are still existing in nature. Even though we have this advanced brain that has, that convinced us that we have somehow separated from nature.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point in the evolution of us, we went from being a creature very much in nature to, this one's tricky trying to get this one into language. And I feel inadequate at it because, as much as I've studied this stuff, I don't consider myself a scholar in it. So the way we'll describe it, I think, will be very layman's and clunky. I like to think back. I consider the history of philosophical thinking in the world as a part of our evolution as well. And if you go back far enough in philosophical evolution from what we know, coming out of like cave paintings and telling stories around a fire, came into ritual in which we were seeing something higher than ourselves. The idea of a god, the idea of entities that are bigger and outside of us. I think that was a neurological advancement that humans went through, to be able to see themselves from outside of themselves. So, some of the early philosophers were the naturalists, and they taught, that the earth was the center of the universe. And this was proved because you drop something and it falls to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more, I think, more dualist way of thinking, a more right brain, left brain way of thinking. And at some point there came that concept of a trinity, right? There's something higher than us. And once we started looking to something higher than us, we could then project ourselves as that thing looking down at ourselves. Which I think is where the concept of observing ourselves came from. That was a neurological advancement. That was something that took place in our evolution as a species that seems to be different than other species.
Mm-hmm.
I think other species probably have I think we have some similarities. It's hard to go and say, like, at what point it was just this kind of neurological thing, and now it's this other this more advanced neurological thing, but it's really the same, like an upgrade from the original system. And once humans started being able to see themselves from above themselves, that's insecurity, self-consciousness, concepts of who am I versus I am just nature. That creates separation.
This is the thing that I keep thinking about from a point of view of a fish.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, does a fish know that it's in the ocean or in a bowl of water? I think it's my belief that fish just is like, I'm in the water, and I don't know how humans have gotten this gift of thinking from different point of view instead of just, and this kind of goes back to life experience life as an experience that we were talking about too, which is that, of course, life is just happening. Things are happening as it's meant to be because the universe is orchestrating all these things. But then why do we get this gift of then evaluating what's happening to me or why or the meaning? And based on what you just described, we're saying that at some period of time in the timeline of evolution, there was this branch that kind of took off, which ended up being where we're at right now as human beings. And that branch has a different neurological, sophisticated neurology it's been built compared to other branches of beings.
Yeah. And I think it's one in which the idea of God exists.
And you would think that all this stuff around philosophy probably came after that branch, like just concepts of philosophy.
Right. Because before that, philosophy was, that's a rock, that's a tree,
Right.
a stick.
Right.
Like,
it's not like, who made it? Why is it here? How did it get, yeah.
Right.
Right.
Well, I think those are probably the first. I think the question of who am I starts out with what is it that's around me? Once we start naming
curiosity, right?
Curiosity. Well, I don't know how much of it's curiosity and how much.
Because apes have curiosity, right? I think curiosity.
Apes have been observed to use tools, right? So there has to be some level in which they have that recognition of pattern. And apes have forms of language that are similar to ours,
right?
The neurology of our cursing, apes have. When there's a predator and you hear them making certain noises, those noises are very guttural and they're similar to our curse words, and they come from the same neurology as curse words come from us. That's where Tourette's is a dysfunction within that part of someone's neurology where they can't control that. It becomes because it's that part of their languaging is different than the other parts of their languaging. And that's something that we have, that apes have as well. That we share that from a common ancestor. So language, so their ability to have language, if you have language, you're able to name the things that are around you, and in the naming things around you, you're going to start just inherently, there's going well, then what am I? Who are the other apes and who am I? So I wouldn't go so far as to say that we're the only ones that have that question of who am I. I think we just have a sophisticated enough brain to take it as far as we do.
I think that's what I was going to say, is that it sounds like even that we share commonality with other species on this planet. And so really what we're talking about as a differentiating factor of who am I, or even observer selves, that's something different than those commonalities. And maybe that has a connection with the things that we cannot see of who we are.
Well, absolutely. If you have eyes, there's going to be things that you can see, and there's going to be things that you simply can't. And some of that's based on the sophistication of the eyes. Mm-hmm. Some of it's going to be the sophistication of the system that is able to take in the data of what's the eyes actually see, and then translate that into meaning.
Yeah.
And there's something about how we do it that's distinctly human, in the way that we do it. I think something that just seems to have separated humans from other species, and it probably happened a long time ago, probably at that split from when we split from apes, or from the other great apes.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe putting a name to it. Maybe it's I think there's something in our nervous system that we can call God. And this is not a religious God. This is not a belief in a God. This is not a belief in whether God exists or not, because this is there whether God exists or not. God doesn't need to exist for this to be something that is there.
You're saying this trait or neurology or something within us that exists that we are calling this as close to as like there's a God.
Right.
Wherever that comes from, that is distinct in that branch
That we evolved with.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of the reason that religion has been such a strong part of human evolution over the past several thousand years, because it drew from that neurology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we see it in our current culture from people who are both religious and not religious. People who don't believe in God still behave in very similar ways. They just may not, the thing that they pray to, or the thing that they are drawn to, they may not call God, they call it something else, but the behavior is still the same. And how it's how it's interacting with their neurology is still the same.
Mm-hmm.
But that's, again, that can be we either have a knowing of this neurology and we go into it with the purpose of seeing, or we have an unknowing of it.
It doesn't mean it's not there.
Right. And religion is an ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this neurology that primes us to be spiritual, and then we have an ideology of religion that plugs into, and that's what we plugged into for the past several thousand years. And now we're at a period of time where the old ideology of religion has been kind of
challenged,
crumbled away a little bit.
Yeah.
But the behaviors are still the same. So we still see very religious behaviors, but they're plugged into different ideologies, politics, culture,
creativity.
Yeah.
How they relate to it.
And so behaviorally, we're still no different than we were 1,000, 2,000 years ago. We've just changed the name of God into something else.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like, not knowing this about ourselves means that we can be programmed by good ideology. We can be programmed by by faulty ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a matter of choosing. If I'm observing and I'm paying attention and I can see that this is how I am, then I'm going to observe how I respond to things such as ideology. So, whether it's religious, political, or cultural. The more I observe, the more I can make choices of, following that particular mindset, that particular idea. What are the outcomes that will take me to? How will it benefit? How will it hurt me? Versus, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
This is a part of the shadow. I'm not observant to it. I'm not looking at it. Well, it's still going to be a part of how I'm making, how I'm decision making, but I'm blind to those decisions. I'm blind to where those decisions are coming from. I'm unaware of how, my thinking, my behaviors are being impacted by this shadow side of me.
How much can we manipulate ourselves to not see it, or matter of fact, oversee it?
A lot. Something I've been kind of toying with is the idea that it is the shadow side that it makes us prone to be manipulated, and either manipulated by others or manipulated by ourselves.
It is the shadow self that is prone to, I'm just repeating it because I'm taking this in.
Yeah.
That makes us prone to be manipulated by others or to manipulate ourselves.
Correct. And to try to manipulate others. We don't necessarily always recognize the ways in which we're trying to manipulate other people. And it comes from that side of us, because there's a side of us that's known. We're here for good, with best intentions. We're doing the best we can. Have a good heart and doing everything right. But yet there's this side of me that's constantly getting in the way. And I think that's true for everybody. Let me kind of get make a more direct metaphorical relationship to the shadow, what we're calling a shadow, right? Neurologically. So we have spinal reflexes. If I take a rubber mallet and I strike you on the knee, you're going to have a knee-jerk reaction. You don't have control over that consciously. Mm-hmm. You can sit there and go, I'm not going to let my knee go, and I'm going to smack that spot and your knee's going to go. You have no control over it. So there's a level in which your neurology overrides you. It's a trigger, right? We have other triggers in us as well. And those triggers are going to be based on our history. It can be based on trauma, based on experience, based on practice, the things that we practice on a regular basis.
Those have triggers? Is that what you're saying?
Well, so think if you're a police officer and you're taught how to react in a very specific situation. Well, if that situation comes up, you are immediately going to be triggered into your training.
Yeah. I guess this goes with like developing habits and stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's part of the observation. What am I training my body? How am I training myself to respond in the world? And am I paying attention to the ways in which I respond to the world that I don't have control over, so that I can, it's not that I can cut them off at the pass. It's just that I'm aware that these things are going to be taking place. When we're in a conversation, somebody says something, they might use a word that we have an association with in some other place that's a trigger for us. Well, they say that word, they may not mean it in the way that it gets triggered, but it gets triggered, and all of a sudden there's an explosion of like emotions and thought wrapped around that word that we may not even be aware of. It's taking place. It's now changing our language, changing the tone of our voice, changing our posture. We might be getting defensive. We might be getting angry, or we might be softening and being like, we might take them for being more well-meaning than they actually are based on that word, or we might take them as being hostile.
Yeah.
More hostile than they actually are based on that.
And that's just like a knee-jerk thing where we don't actually have control over whatever is happening internally.
Right.
Chemically, emotionally. Yeah.
And we can't necessarily get control of it. One of the things I like to tell people is that we don't have control over very much. We don't have control over the world, and we don't even have control over how we respond to the world. The only thing we have any level of control over is how we respond to the world. And that's where that layer of observations is useful, valuable, helpful. Because taking time to observe how we respond starts to enlighten us. It
changes outcomes.
If there's any kind of a flashlight that we can put to the shadow, that is it.
Whoa. Okay. Slow down. The only thing we have control over is the way we respond to the way we respond. And that is the closest thing to us putting a flashlight onto the darker areas of ourselves.
Yeah.
That happens retrospectively. Does that happen in real time?
It happens with
practice. Yeah. Right.
And it takes time. It takes time to develop that as a practice.
So you're basically building that neurology, just like you would work out a specific part of your body.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're training.
Yeah. Our last session, you asked if there was like a guide, a blueprint, a manual. I'm like, well, this is a manual. Understanding these things about us, gives us a little bit like, what
part of this is a manual?
The idea of observation, right? Humans have been writing that for thousands of years. To observe, to meditate, to breathe, move. Like none of that is new practice. Pretty much if you dive into any ancient wisdom of spirituality, those are inherently in it. So humans have known this for a long time. So that, our history is a is a manual, is a guidebook. But we have to take the time to observe it,
Mm.
To learn it, to study ourselves through what has been practiced, take what works from it for ourselves, leave some of it behind, because even that, our practice is something that evolves. So the way it was 2,000 years ago isn't the way it should be now.
Mm-hmm.
But there's going to be a lot of things that are held over that were working then that still work now. And breath, meditation, movement, and journaling, I'd say journaling is a more modern addition to it, are incredibly beneficial tools of observation, to observe ourselves and to learn, like, how do I respond to the world? When I start to see how I respond to the world on a day-to-day basis, in just my meditation and just my thoughts and just the things that annoy me, and then observing the annoyance and what that feels like. What does annoyance feel? What does anger feel like when it comes up in my meditation? The more I feel that, now when I'm out in the world and I feel anger, I'm alerted to it sooner. Because
you're connected to it.
Because I now have an association to it as a thing. And if in my meditation, when the anger comes up, if I learn to work with my breath in order to not bottle it down, not try to ignore it, not compartmentalize it and put it over here for later, but to just feel it, to let it come up and let it move, and to see that, it actually has a flow to it. It's going to come up big, and if I keep breathing, it's going to recede, just like a wave, and it will be gone. It's not a permanent state. When I practice that in my meditation, I can do that in the world. I can be in a conversation with someone and I can feel that. And I don't even have to let them know what I'm doing. I can just let them talk, take some breaths, and I can feel that state within me change. Which then means I'm no longer in a state of provoked anger.
Mm-hmm.
I'm nowhere in a state of like receded anger, which are going to be different emotional states, which means what I say, how I act, how I respond are going to be different based on that. But it all starts with observation.
I remember when I first would do a guided meditation, and there was this concept of observing thoughts that would be like, I have an itch, or I have this impulse to get up and even drink water, whatever they be, or I feel it. So it could be thoughts and it could be feelings. And the task was to really just note that. And what was beneficial to me is, in that moment, if negative thoughts came to be, it wasn't to go in with the hammer and smash down. It was to observe it like a feather. Like you just touching it with the feather and like, oh, okay, cool. And then you keep paying attention to the breath. And I think that practice has, of course, allowed me to do this thing that we're talking about of observing ourselves. B, have a relationship to the good and the bad. We talked about that in the last episode too, where we want to be mindful of that kind of language. Because none of it is good or bad. It's really just happening.
Can I flip this a little bit?
Mm.
So we started the question off with, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Well, who am I is, and we kind of think we touched upon this with the idea of like naming things, being able to name things. Who am I? How do I know who am I? Who am I if I'm not also asking the question of who are you? Who am I in relationship to others? There's an aspect of our neurology that is shared. And this one's tricky because how do you share neurology? Like where does it take place? Where does it exist? Where can we point to how your neurology and my neurology are connecting and interacting with each other? Knowing that neurology is a very physical thing within my body, but yet there's these levels in which we connect outside of ourselves. I don't know how, I'm posing this as more as a question, maybe to get into deeper, because I don't really have a specific for it, but I think it's an important part of the question. Because who am I? You know, I have a starting point and then I have an ending point, and where I end, something else exists. And so, what am I doing if I'm not trying to figure out where is that line, and what is that? Is it a boundary? What does it look like? Is it a wall? Is it more of a membrane? Does it allow things to flow in and out, or is it,
a brick wall? Yeah.
Brick wall built. We can have immaculate walls that really help protect us, or we can have very thin walls, or we can have no walls at all.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that with relationship to things that are outside of what we know to be our physical body, but then, intellectual, emotional, mental. Outside of that, I think something that struck my curiosity was you saying that there's some shared thing that's happening, right? So I have my physical bodies. I perceive it that my leg, starts from somewhere. It ends here. There is a wall here. And then I know that you have your physical body and you have your leg over there. And you're saying we're just talking about legs there. But then there are certain things that's common. What do you think? What do you think they are? What do they look like? What do they sound like? I mean, if you were to put a word or like language to it.
This is tricky because it's we're getting into like the pseudoscience, the mystical realm. So I think I would call it like it's the metaphysics. My inclination is to say that there are things that are measurable that we just don't have the tools to measure. And so let me use an example of things that I would how I would look at like the areas in which we are shared. Somebody walks in the room and they just have an energy, right? And people in that room feel they're gravitated to that person. Like what is it that draws me to this person that I might not know? They just walk into a room and like everybody's eyes goes to that person. Something about that is a shared neurology. Empathy, like true empathy, to feel with someone.
That's what came to me too. We're talking about pain.
Pain, yeah. Like that, there's something about that is shared, that what is triggered in someone else can be triggered in me as well. Where's that point that was like physically connecting us, but yet here we are having this shared experience. People who have mystical experiences. There's people who have mystical experiences in groups. It's beyond our ability to explain, but yet it happens enough that it's, I wouldn't call it BS. I think it's something that's real. There's something real there. We just don't know what it is. I think pair bonding, there's a different neurology that is shared for people who are not pair bonded, people who are, more promiscuous in their intimacy compared to people who are less, somebody who's like just intimate with one person. That neurology that is created between those two people, is profoundly more impactful, whether for good or for bad, depending on how they interact in that neurology, compared to people who just don't spend enough time in order to build that shared neurology. I think it's what we're talking about is something that is not strictly human. How do bees know their place and know to work for something that's more common and not just be individual bees or ants in that same way. I think the shared neurology is something that is actually fairly common.
So I think, would you say that, like, you talk about bees, and I don't know if you said ants, or I just heard that in my head.
No, I said ants, yeah.
It's like they can work together as a team to like lift the log across the road, and
it seems to happen without a whole lot of conversation going on.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
They just start doing it.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and there's
I mean, I feel like
we can probably point out to some tangible things like ants secrete scents to help them communicate. So there's probably forms of communication, but is language not a shared neurology? You know, our sense of smell, you know, our body produces smells to attract mates. Is that not a part of our shared neurology? So there are tangible physical things that connect us. And I think there's also things that we haven't really fully grasped that are there as well.
So this is interesting because I think what we're talking about here, in a way, is not facing the sun.
Right. These are, if a shared neurology is not something that's in the sunlight, that is something that's going to be hidden.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's far deeper than any of us pay attention to on a regular basis.
Yeah. Or perceive. Yeah. Can perceive.
Yeah.
So, okay, so common, that's cool. This thing of where do I begin? Where do I end? And then this notion of that boundary being permeable versus bricks. I think I want to talk about that concept in a more tangible way for humans to interact with one another. And maybe you can even use examples of coupleship or best friends or whatever that may be, and how knowing who you are is essential to be better human beings.
I don't know if it's essential, but I think it's helpful.
Because you could be like an ape and you're still being a human being.
Well,
in a way.
Let's be honest about humans. We are nature, and nature is both benevolent and level. What's that word? I always struggle with that. Whenever I say them back to back, I always struggle with the second one. We are capable of great beauty, and we're capable of great destruction.
Yeah.
Which means that I think that there are humans who are born into the planet that do not have good, well-meaning intentions, and they can do all the things that I'm talking about doing, and they can become very self-aware, know who they are, and do terrible things.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to pretend like this is somehow like
to make being a good human being.
Right.
Here we go. Good and bad. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's, I want to go back to where you were starting at, and I feel like I lost that place. But I wanted to put that pin out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to put it back to you because I want to let you re-say that or restate the question.
Yeah. We were just talking about the membrane versus walls and how that shows up when we're interacting with other human beings.
Mm-hmm. Do you have more specific questions with it?
No, I think I really want to talk about how me observing my feelings, my thoughts, where I stand on a particular point of view, or in a discussion, in an argument, observing where I stand, questioning what my closest to truth is, how that has helped me be confident and comfortable in the discomfort. And I really want to like highlight that and talk about that concept.
So earlier I talked about, in my meditation, by observing how I respond to the disturbances within me, and I feel the anger or I might feel fear or I might feel judgment. And I get comfortable with those uncomfortable feelings and feel how they come in as a flood and they also recede. So, this too shall pass. It's kind of a good way of referencing those. Like, this too shall pass. Like, things are going to come up as a big storm and the storm will pass. And there's things that I can do to help move through the storm. And the more I do that, when I'm interacting with other people and I catch that trigger, get kicked up, I can do my work in that moment and help that storm recede, which changes how I behave. There's another side to this. Because we have shared neurology. If somebody else is in fear, somebody else is in judgment, they're provoked. We can sense that because we generally mirror each other. Now we sense this one way or the other, right? This is just something that we sense. So generally, if somebody's fear is provoked, judgment is provoked, it will provoke mine too. But if I'm unaware, if I don't observe these processes of how I react and respond, I will project what it is that I'm feeling and I'll put it back on them. It will change how, oh, they're judging me. Oh, they're manipulating me. Oh, they're doing this to me, is generally kind of how we respond when we are unaware.
So real quick, here in this storyline, it could be that this other person is judging them or putting fear in them, or it could be that they are judging themselves or they are fearful, and then we are sensing that, and we are then it's like really complex of this dynamic that's happening between who we are, who that other person is. There's this shared thing that's happening.
Right. I would be careful with them putting fear in us, because fear is manipulating them. Judgment is manipulating them. So they may be unaware of how they're being manipulated and how that might be changing the way that they're communicating with us. So it may not be intentional. It may not be conscious. They're not trying to put fear in us. I think most people are not trying to manipulate other people with intention. I think it's unintentional. This just comes from lack of awareness. We don't pay attention to ourselves in this way. And so we just go around and we're like flinging stuff at each other.
So I think this is beautiful, because this is where I cannot control what your shadow self might be doing right in this second. Right. But what we're talking about this is more into the tangible thing, where so long I'm practicing, observing myself, my thoughts, and if, let's say, I get a trigger and that says, hey, I think I might be getting manipulated here, and then I'm observing that for myself, then to have that reflection within myself, like, what is the closest to my truth? What's happening? And do I feel manipulated right now? Or is this something else? Or maybe this is just something that's transient, where there's a wave coming up, it too shall recede. And that is something that I can be in closest relationship to, compared to like trying to be like, hey man, like, you're being manipulated. You got to stop that, because that's not even remotely in my control.
Right. Well, and it might not even be true.
Right. Right. Because it's storylines.
Right.
Right.
Because if I make the other person out to be a bad actor, when it's really just that they're unconscious to what isn't going on internally, then I've just created a story that's going to create
But there's no way to know.
There's no way to. So here's let me pose an idea, a concept. What is manipulation? To me, it's something physical. So the only way for another human being to manipulate me is for them to be bigger and stronger and to physically manipulate me, to force me, which is a thing.
Right.
Right?
Right.
But if someone is using words, then is it that they're manipulating me, or is it that I'm allowing myself to be manipulated? That I'm ultimately, it's my shadow side that is manipulating me. I'm buying into their words. I don't know myself well enough to be able to go, no, that's not right. That's not true.
Yeah.
That's not me.
Yeah.
So I think most of the time that people talk about you're manipulating me is because they're not taking ownership and responsibility for themselves. And it may be that they don't have the tools to be able to do that. And like that is a problem. But this is that gray area where it's really hard to I don't want to blame somebody who's been victimized, who's been taken advantage of because they don't have good tools, versus somebody who is might be taking advantage. I think there's a lot of people who take advantage and don't realize that they're taking advantage, not conscious. It's programming, and it's just, reacting or responding to a world in which they are unaware of their shadow self, and they don't recognize in what ways that what they do and how they do it might be detrimental to the people around them. And then the people around them don't have the strength or aren't empowered enough within themselves to stand up and say no.
Yeah. This is what I wanted to talk about, because that's an example of a feeling, or maybe an idea or a thought, and that remains to be true with the whole spectrum of feelings. Because I think I experienced this, and I got to exercise and learn through about this mostly from my anger, actually. That's how I started my work with words. Like, you're making me angry. Like, I would really think that to myself, and I would really even probably say it to others. And what we're talking about here is that in reality, that's mine. Like, if I feel angry, no matter whatever happened in the world, that's mine, and nobody's made me do that. It's in a way, I've really done it to myself. It's happening to me.
Right. Well, anger has been triggered. Anger is a neurology. It's a part of our anger is a part of our emotional system that is there to protect us.
Yeah.
So anger serves us, and it serves us really well. It can also serve us poorly if we're not observing the ways in which we allow our anger to be expressed in the world. It can hurt us just as much as it can help us. But if I need a boundary, anger is is how I set boundaries.
This is how it's useful. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Whether that boundary is physical, bear jumps out in the woods, I'm not going to give it a hug. I'm probably going to have a fear and an anger response. And it's going to be aggressive. I'm either ready to put up a fight, I'm ready to run.
Yeah.
And hopefully I'm in touch enough that I'm not so red with anger that I just charge at the bear, right? Like that I'm still able to have some mental faculties to be able to
be strategic.
Yeah. Which is really hard to do when anger and fear comes up, because it floods. We're no longer conscious. Like, when we get triggered into fight or flight, there's a process that takes place that we don't have any control of. Our heart rate speeds up, our breath speeds up. We start losing blood flow to our frontal cortex, which is long-term planning. Our ability to think into the future is reduced because there's a bear in front of us. There's no reason to think about my taxes being due in 3 months.
Yeah.
blood goes away from our digestive system because there's no reason for digesting that food if we're not going to survive the next 15 minutes. And instead, blood goes to our extremities where we're ready. Heart is pumping, respiration increases. We are ready to fight.
Yeah.
We're really, and we're kind of retreating more to a mammalian or reptilian brain, part of our brain. And the tricky thing is that we respond in a world as if bears are attacking us all the time, and there are no bears. So we are constantly triggered in a state of fight or flight in which we don't have access to our frontal cortex. We don't have as much access to planning down the future. We're more in this immediate, which is part of the reason that most of the decisions that we make are about our immediate gratification and not about our long-term benefit.
How do we practice being in touch with these kinds of trigger points, and what are some of the things that we could do to battle this "there's a bear in front of me" signal when it's really just a message on my phone?
Well, it's understanding our nervous system, right? Our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, states of fight or flight, rest and restore. It's a spectrum. And if we can go in one direction with the spectrum, we can come back to the other side. And the area that we have the most ability to access that part of our nervous system is directly with our breath. Slowing down, taking deep breaths, getting into putting our feet on the ground, opening up, meditating, paying attention. One of the ways, anger and fear, I'd like to, they're chemical concoctions that our body produces and floods the entire system. It gets sent into the bloodstream so that it reaches everything as fast as it can. And every cell in the body is fed by the bloodstream. So if it's in your blood, it's in every cell of your body. It's a chemical cascade. When that trigger hits, we feel it. Why anger is it's almost vibrational.
Yeah.
So taking deep breaths brings in oxygen, helps dilute those chemicals. Those chemicals get reabsorbed, they get filtered back through, and we move through that wave. And the more practiced we are at catching the trigger early, getting to our breath, and taking the time to work through it, over time we get better and better at it. So that's again, here's the guidebook. We've known this for centuries. This is not new information. We may have better understanding of the science around it.
Yeah.
But humans have known this without the science. So it's not new knowledge. That's where it starts, and in that it puts us in a state of observation as well, right? Taking deep breaths allows us to start observing. We're immediately slowing down and observing. Is this actually a bear?
Yeah.
Right. If it's a bear, then, man, yeah, I want my anger to fly. Right. I don't want to hold it back at all. Yeah. I'm like, I want to be ready to fight or flight as much as I need to in order to survive, because survival is ultimately still, the number one rule.
So I'm going to set the scene a little bit, going back to kind of what we already talked about, where you're with a group of people and you're interacting with people. There's this common neurology that we're all, a part of, and you sense something, and an anger gets triggered. It can be fear, it could be judgment, all of it. Love, for that matter. And we're talking about when you feel that trigger, the more you practice, we will understand first, like, oh, that I just felt that. That's different than just a second ago where my state of being was. So in the example of like, let's say anger, that happens, we're going to reflect on that. We're going to take deep breaths. How do you suppose that this would play out in that real world scenario where, let's say, I doubt that your breath, like 2-3 deep breaths, is enough to just be like, I'm good now. So what are some possibilities that you being in that room changes or alters? Like, what are some combinations?
That might be putting the cart before the horse. You know how in class, when you first started coming in, we'd go through movements and I'd talk about pay attention to how it feels on one side compared to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And all I'm doing is bring us into awareness of what's actually going on in our body. But then I would also say, don't do anything specific with that information. Just observe it. We have to go through a period of time of observation before we're going to be able to utilize that observation for change.
For action.
Yeah. To be able to see it create change. It's going to be faster and slower for different people, but for the most part, it's slow.
Yeah.
It could be a year or 2 or 5 of being in observation before we really start to see how that changes how we interact with other people in those circumstances. I'd say I have kind of more like simple rules for those settings, which I think are helpful. And the first one is like the earlier we get comfortable with recognizing, being observant of the trigger.
I remember, sorry to cut you off, but there for sure were times just this year where I would be like in the fight, and in the midst of it is when I would realize like, whoa, like I am livid.
Yeah. And so that at that moment,
is way past the trigger point, obviously.
Well, and that's often how it's going to be.
Yeah. That's what you go really slow and
slow. Yeah. And so when you catch the trigger and you're in with people, the world is shut up. Become an observer. It doesn't mean don't participate, but it means stop letting stuff come out of your mouth when you know you're triggered. And it, if it's appropriate, you let other people know, like, I'm processing, I got some stuff coming up. So I'm just quiet. I'm observing. I want to hear what you have to say. Or just flip it and ask them a question. People love to talk about themselves. So it's really easy to do this in a group setting. It's really easy to just shut up. Because it's the things that I say and how that I say them, it's more likely to make things messier than they already are. So the trick is to just stop talking.
Mm-hmm.
And stop talking is another opportunity to observe, because you get to observe yourself and then you get to observe others. Because if you're triggered, they're probably triggered too. And this will kind of come back to what we were talking about with the shared neurology. Being an observance to my stuff, it's uncomfortable and it's upsetting. But at some point, I start to become observant to other people's stuff too. It's like, oh, I'm angry. And it's like, I can hear their anger too. I can hear their fear too. And I can use that as a bludgeon. I can attack them with it.
Right.
Which is what when we project, that's what we tend to do. Or I can remind myself like, oh, look at how much the same we actually are. Look at what we have in common.
Empathy.
Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I got a monkey mind too. I got a little guy in there that likes to have, like, I got a toddler that likes to have a tantrum every once in a while and just wants to have a big screaming fit. And it's like, I can see that in you. And instead of judging you and putting more anger focus on you, it's like I can chuckle a little bit at us, like bring a little levity to it. Like, here we are just being human. And sometimes just that level of breathing in and seeing that, it's like all of a sudden that, whatever was up isn't up quite as high. It might be there on the surface, but it's like, oh, it's a little different. And it changes how we're in that conversation. The other person can feel that change too. So it can change for them as well. But the idea that we're going to be able to do like advanced work where we're in the moment, we're going to surrender and we're going to say the perfect thing is probably not going to happen.
What does that even mean? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We're messy creatures and we're going to make a mess. And we're going to get triggered and we're not going to catch it in the moment. And even if we catch it in the moment, we still got to deal with the flood of chemicals that are going on in our body that are changing us. And sometimes I can't get out of that. Sometimes it's appropriate that I'm angry. Sometimes it's appropriate. Sometimes the other person needs to hear that from me. So I don't want to necessarily be so controlled. I'm not trying to control myself because I don't have that.
That's important to note here is that the goal is not, okay, these chemicals are flooded now dilute it as fast as possible because that could be extremely detriment to when we actually need that. Like a bear would come and like you're trying to flood that. Like, you need that. If anything, you need more of that.
Right.
Or the worse, don't produce these chemicals. This ideology that, hey, why do these chemicals keep getting produced like every 5 minutes? Like, stop. Like that sounds like a wormhole in itself. That's not helpful.
I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's good. I don't think it helps people thrive. The people I trust at least are the people who say they never experience anger or fear or anything else. Like if somebody says they don't have those feelings, I don't believe them.
Yeah.
Right. I find them to be a distrustful person because of that. They're not, and again, whether it's not that they're necessarily lying, it's that they have a level in which they don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I've been there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not.
We're all there.
I literally is like, I'm not angry. I think I'm frustrated. And it's like, and then I remember you telling me, it's like, well, like frustration is a level of anger.
And for no matter how observant we become to ourselves, there's always going to be always where our eyes are at that we can see. And there's going to be a shadow to even that. And there's no way that we have omnipotent power to see it all the time. That's not like, so it's there's some silliness that we can get into with it where that's not the point. The point is not to be perfect. The point is not to never make a mess. I think some of the times in which we get provoked and it makes a mess, I find to be some of the most beautiful and beneficial and hilarious times that we can have with people. If we're willing to have some grace, some grace for ourselves and some grace for others. And I think that's part of what the process allows us to have is to remind ourselves that, if I'm not in observation to myself or to others, then it's very easy to live in a universe in which I am the center. I am the entire center of the universe and everything gravitates towards me. Right? This is like old ways of thinking and with that we have expanded beyond, but yet we're still very fixed in. It makes us very selfish, self-centered. When we can get to that point of observation and recognize like, I might be unique. I'm a unique human, but I am a unique human having a shared human experience. And at that level in which we're shared, we are so common. We are 99.9% alike. A fingerprint, two fingerprints, you look at two different fingerprints, they look identical because in most ways they are.
Yeah.
but
yeah, they're so distinct.
but yet at the same time, incredibly distinct.
Yeah. Beautiful. Here we are. I thought TAOTalks was about shining a light to exploring meaning and thoughts. It's lovely, the antithesis of what we talked about, where it's like there's always going to be things, there's always going to be the dark side of us. And that's not even the point, that we have sun just revolving around us, because it just literally turns into the universe is revolving around us.
Yeah. And again, it's only a shadow side because it does, like, light can't be cast everywhere, nor would we want light to be cast. If light was cast everywhere, if there were no shadows, we would have no sight.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
The whole purpose for sight is the ability to be able to differentiate
Right.
what is seen versus what is unseen.
Right. Right.
And our eyes evolved specifically
The contrast.
for that.
I know that contrast.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there were predators in the dark.
Yeah.
That we needed to be able to see those patterns and recognize them before we were conscious that they were there.
Yeah.
And so, that's actually a really good example of things in the shadow. Like, knowing what's in the shadow is valuable because it's dangerous, but the earlier that we see it, the better we can respond to it. Whether it's a snake, scorpion, some other kind
In
of
the
predator.
physical world.
In the physical world.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
You made it all the way to the end. Thank you again for watching all the way through. I appreciate that you showed up here. And if you enjoyed it, go ahead and like, comment, or subscribe, or share it with your friends as well. See you in the next episode. Bye.